Thanks, Stephen. Well, a very great pleasure to be here today to be able to present some of the material in this report on behalf of a very distinguished Balanced Budget Commission, and I thank my colleagues on that commission for their hard work and their thoughts. This I think arose from what I still consider to be a most unusual circumstance in Australian life. That is that here we are in 25 years of uninterrupted economic expansion. Our household wealth is today 5 times higher than it was when this expansion started in 1991. And yet, despite this evidence of very long-running prosperity, we find ourselves now in the 8th year of a Commonwealth fiscal deficit, and not a trivial one. The last time I checked, the deficit for this year will be 37, maybe 40 billion, quite a significant share of GDP. And even in the government's projections, the deficit continues for another 4 years. That'll make 12 in all. And as I said, without a recession to motivate it. We've had deficits before. Of course, we had them coming out of the recession of 80-81. A very significant deficit. We closed that one in 6 years. We closed it in 6 years. We came out of the 1991 recession, again with a deficit, and we closed that in 7 years. And we find ourselves today looking at 12 years, but not a recession at the origination of this deficit. As a share of GDP, the deficit is already bigger than the cumulative shares of GDP of the two previous, of either of the two previous deficit episodes in our recent history, and will soon exceed their combined total. So it's quite a big thing. It's quite a big thing, and in my view, and in the view of the board of CEDA when we came to discuss it, it's a concern. It's a concern because despite our prosperity, we've decided to send a bill for a large part of the bill for our current spending. Current government spending, we decided to send that bill to our kids rather than pay it ourselves. And there's a moral issue in there, of course. But not only that, we're not taking advantage as we could of our prosperity to build in greater defence against whatever challenge the world might throw at us, as it no doubt will at some point, even if we succeed in perpetuating our own domestic prosperity. That is, we have an opportunity to return the budget to surplus and we're not taking advantage of it. Well, so we think it's a problem. We thought it was a grave problem, and the CEDA board resolved to appoint a Budget Balance Commission, and I'm glad to say that we found some very distinguished members who were prepared to join that effort. Now, when the Budget Balance Commission met, we decided on some principles. One was that the deficit doesn't need to be eliminated immediately, but it would be useful to eliminate it in 2 years, in 2018-19. And then we said, let's put ideology aside for a moment and just look at what you might call the revealed preference of Australian politics. What do the major parties accept as being decent principles for Australian government fiscal policy? And broadly speaking, both major parties accept that and have acted in government and have enunciated the principle that they want a balanced budget over the course of the cycle. That's important. Now, we also found that in all the years from the introduction of the GST to the global financial crisis in 2008-9, the share of tax to GDP was 23.9%. And a similar number, 23.9%, was used by Treasurer Peter Costello as the tax cap in his intergenerational reports. It was then used by Wayne Swan in his intergenerational reports. It was used by Joe Hockey, and it's again being used by Treasurer Scott Morrison in the current mid-year economic and financial outlook, fiscal outlook. 23.9 as the cap on tax. Well, if you're in a position where the major parties agree that we should have a budget balance, and they also agree and have enunciated a view that tax should be capped at 23.9, you can add in 1.5, 1.6% of revenue from non-tax sources, which is a persistent share for the Commonwealth. And this gets you, if you want to balance the budget, you've got to confine spending to 25.5% of GDP. It's just a little bit of very straightforward arithmetic. So that was our principles, that whatever we disagree about, the truth is, over the years we've agreed that the budget needs to be balanced, and we've agreed over the years, over the last decade, both parties, that tax should be capped at 23.9% of GDP. So then we said, well, let's balance it at 2018-19. What do we need to do? And we had a look at the forward estimates. It turns out that at that point, tax was 23.1% of GDP. So in order to get up to the cap, we had to increase tax by 0.8% of GDP, and spending was, after adjustment, was 23.8, I think, so 25.8. So we needed to reduce that by around about 0.2% of GDP, and that's what we did. We looked at ways to do that that would be reasonably fair, that would have a reasonable chance of public acceptance, wouldn't have too much impact on demand in that particular year, that could be accommodated by the economy, but which would produce a balance. Now, I'll tell you a bit more just before I conclude about what the options are that we identified, but I'd like to reiterate Stephen's point that they're not options to which we are particularly committed. There are 5 of them. Different members had different views about which of them they would prefer, or they would mix and match from among them. But they all agreed that these were well within the range of the contemporary political debate and unlikely to be reversed by by the alternative party if it subsequently came to office. Well, just before I mention some of those alternatives, let me revert back to the issue of why it is that we find ourselves with 8 years of deficits, another 4 to go. Deficits are much bigger than the ones that we have encountered coming out of very serious recessions, and yet we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. Only CEDA really has made an issue of this. The Business Council hasn't made an issue of it. Not that I want to drag the Business Council's name into this, but it hasn't. Other organisations generally don't. You don't really see it discussed very much in the Financial Review or the Australian. The government doesn't talk about it a lot, and for that matter, neither does the opposition. CEDA alone is talking about it. And why is this? Well, one reason, I guess, is that we just got used to it. Maybe that's part of it. But another part of it is, I suppose, that we look at the forward estimates and we find that in 4 years the deficit is closed. But the point I want to make about that is that it's only closed because of increases in revenue. About 75% of the improvement in our fiscal position over the next 4 years is coming from additional revenue, and that is entirely, almost entirely, from increased personal income tax, and that's almost entirely from, as an increase as a share of GDP, it's almost entirely coming from bracket creep. Well, one view we formed in the Commission and on the board was that this is just not a plausible, credible, likely outcome, that between now and the point at which the deficit would be closed under this program, which is there in the forward estimates for the budget, repeated again in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook not long ago, that this won't happen. It won't happen because between now and then we're going to have at least 2 elections, and one party or the other, or both, are going to say this is not a reasonable approach, and we're going to have a set of tax cuts that will prevent the bracket creep occurring that the closure of the deficit depends upon. So we're instead proposing an alternative way of doing it. We're proposing doing it earlier than the forward estimates suggest, and in dollar terms, given that tax at that point, 2018-19, is well under the 23.9 cap, most of the addition comes from additional revenue. 15 billion of the required 17 will come from additional revenue, and 2 billion will come from spending cuts, which are also identified in our options. Now, this is a staggering number, we readily admit, and there's none of the options that any of us would have wished to adopt if you didn't have to. They're all unpleasant. But it's a relevant consideration, I think, that once you do close the deficit, you can then begin a serious discussion about tax reform. And you can't beforehand, to my mind, to have a serious discussion about tax reform at this point when we have a $37 billion deficit and the knowledge that even under implausible circumstances it won't be narrowed to zero for another 4 years. It's a fairy tale conversation. It's only after, in my view, only after we close the deficit or have a plausible plan to do it that we can start to talk seriously about tax reform, and in particular we can, once the deficit is closed, once we're at 23.9% of GDP, tax to GDP, we can then eliminate bracket creep henceforward. Well, I won't go in detail into the options. Broadly speaking, on the tax side, you don't have many choices. You've got superannuation, capital gains, negative gearing. They're the areas to look at, and a bit on indirect taxes like cigarettes, alcohol. For example, by introducing marginal tax rates, the marginal tax rate you pay on your other income to your superannuation, but giving a 15% concession, you get about halfway, a little more than halfway, of what you need on the tax side. You can get a lot further by reducing or eliminating the capital gains tax concession for individuals that was introduced not so long ago. You can get a little bit further along by eliminating negative gearing. And on the spending side, we offer options such as, 10% cut in industry support programs and some further reduction in the cost of the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. No doubt we'll detail those in more in the discussion, and I won't go into them in any more detail here, except to underline the point that, unpleasant as they are less unpleasant than the alternative possibility, which is there in the forward estimates, of relying entirely on bracket creep to close this deficit. Thank you.